Welcome to Why Underwater is Different. In this lesson, we're starting with the adjustment that affects everything else underwater. White balance isn't just another slider. It creates the foundation for every edit that follows. Next, we'll look at why underwater photographers often think something still looks wrong, even after moving lots of sliders. You get back from an amazing dive, import your footage and start editing. You adjust exposure, add contrast, boost vibrance, maybe even push the saturation, but the colors still don't look right. The blues look wrong, the corals look dull or muddy. The whole image just feels off. Let's talk about why this happens. The problem isn't your editing, it's underwater light. To understand why, we need to look at what the water does to color. Water changes light before your camera ever records the image. Reds disappear first, then orange and yellow begin fading. As you go deeper, blue and green start taking over. That's why underwater photos often look cool, flat, and lacking life. Lightroom isn't creating the problem. It's trying to work with what the camera captured. So if water changed the light first, what adjustment should happen first? White balance is always the first correction because it fixes the color shift caused by water. If you skip it, you start compensating with other sliders and end up creating more problems. Get the color foundation right first, then everything else becomes easier and more accurate. This is one of the biggest differences between random editing and repeatable workflow. Now that we understand why white balance comes first, let's look at a real example and see the difference it makes. Here's a real example. Same image, before and after correcting white balance. Notice how the coral goes from dull and green to natural and vibrant. This is why white balance must come first. It fixes the foundation so every other adjustment you make works correctly. Now that you've seen the difference, let's look at the two main white balance tools in Lightroom and when to use each one. Lightroom gives you two ways to correct white balance. The first is the white balance selector, often called the eyedropper. It works by clicking on something that should be neutral. The second method is adjusting temperature and tint manually. Underwater, I often use the eyedropper as a starting point, but temp and tint are where the real refinement happens. That's where you recover natural underwater color. Let's look at when the eyedropper works well and when it can actually make things look worse. The eyedropper works best when there's something truly neutral in the scene. A slate, a tank, sand, or bare metal give Lightroom a good reference point. The challenge is that most underwater photos don't contain anything truly neutral. Coral isn't neutral, fish aren't neutral, blue water definitely isn't neutral. That's why the eyedropper often gets you close, but not all the way there. You still need to refine the result using temperature and tint. So if the eyedropper only gets us close, how do we make the final correction? Let's look at how temperature and tint work together. Once the eyedropper gets you close, temperature and tint do the real work. Temperature controls the blue to yellow balance. Underwater, that usually means restoring warmth and bringing back reds and oranges that were lost with depth. Tint controls green to magenta balance. This becomes especially important in green water, algae-rich environments, and many video clips. Together, temperature and tint allow you to create natural looking color that matches what you actually saw underwater. This is where white balance becomes a skill instead of a button. The next question is, how far should you push these sliders before the image starts looking fake? One of the most common mistakes underwater photographers make is pushing white balance too far. They finally discover temperature and tint, and suddenly every image becomes orange and magenta. The goal isn't maximum color. The goal is believable color. Ask yourself, does this look like what I actually saw underwater? If the edit is drawing more attention than the subject, you've probably gone too far. Natural almost always wins. So if the natural color is the goal, how do we arrive there quickly and consistently every time? Let's look at a simple white balance workflow you can use on almost every underwater image. Here's the simple process I use on almost every underwater image. Start with the eyedropper if you have a neutral target. Then adjust temperature to restore warmth and recover lost reds and oranges. Next, use tint to remove unwanted green casts and fine-tune the balance. Finally, take a step back and evaluate the entire image. Ask yourself whether it looks believable and whether it matches what you experienced underwater. That's the difference between correcting color and inventing color. Follow the sequence, trust the process. Now let's watch this workflow applied to a real underwater photograph from start to finish. Let's look at a real example. On the left is an image straight from my camera. Notice how difficult it is to immediately identify the seahorse and appreciate the scene. In the middle, we've only corrected white balance. The sponge becomes purple, the seahorse becomes more visible, and the image starts making sense. On the right, we've completed the rest of the workflow. White balance, exposure, presence, color, masking, final adjustments. White balance didn't create the final image. It created the foundation that made every other adjustment more effective. That's why white balance always comes first. Now that you understand why white balance comes first, let's look at where to go next and how to continue improving your underwater photography. Next week, we're going to look at why underwater is different, number 3. Exposure depends on white balance. You'll learn why getting white balance correct first makes exposure decisions easier and more accurate. If you'd like to continue learning, scan one of the QR codes on the screen. It shows my weekly blog, 10 Lightroom fixes every underwater photographer should know, and my YouTube channel, Bob H underscore H2O. Until next time, dive safe, shoot often, edit with intention.